Let's see. So hello and welcome to our Impactful Projects and Planning micro training series. I'm Jamie Yazdani. In today's session, we've got David Norris here to talk about the importance of stories to projects and planning. So Dave is the CEO of Proofpact, a nonprofit social proof and engagement software. So thanks for joining me, Dave. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. So tell us a little bit about you and your work and Proofpact.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and excited to be part of the first one, by the way. Yay. So Proofpact is social proof and engagement software built for nonprofits that helps them collect stories from their community, engage those storytellers, and then socialize those stories as proof of impact. And I'd say that there's a heavy focus on donors specifically, but there's many other cohorts and constituents that, where user experiences can benefit from having something like this as a mechanism for collecting that feedback, strategic planning being one of them, of course.
Great. So the kind of big question today I really want to get into is why stories matter. And specifically, what value do stories bring to mission-driven organizations like nonprofits?
Yeah, good question. So I think if we take this one step back, further back here, and we think about reviews, kind of tend to be the 5-star mechanic or mechanism that turns, I call it turning a constituent into a critic, which is something I don't think nonprofits really want to do. Obviously, they're all looking for the same thing. They're looking for sort of this meat on the bone, emotional aspect of what a story actually is, right? Like it's telling of an experience had that gets down into nitty gritty sometimes, and sometimes it is emotional, sometimes it is likely should be confidential in some cases. But for the most part, again, I said taking it a step further back, like reviews don't really work for nonprofits. I'd say 9 times out of 10, maybe even higher of a percentage. But stories also are inclusive of, a community's voice, right? And it's not just this arbitrary score that's shared. And I'd say it's that inclusivity that really engages others from the community and shows them too that this nonprofit is actively listening. It's not just a monologue anymore, it's a dialogue. And so I think as a long-winded way to answer that question, that would be my answer.
Cool. So I think, so I do think the review thing is kind of interesting because there are so many ways to capture reviews, but in a nonprofit or even other mission-driven organizations, kind of daily engagements, that's not necessarily what they're looking for. And I do think there's some confidentiality sometimes around people not wanting to review certain services that nonprofits maybe offer. And so I know for me, I see a lot in my planning work how important stories can really be. And I know that with a lot of strategic planning, often folks do, kind of surveys and things of their community, but I've really seen the value of listening to people's stories and often through interviews. And so I recently worked with a nonprofit that was doing kind of a shorter term strategic planning, and we were looking at priorities or strategic priorities and kind of an implementation plan. And so we did a bunch of interviews of board members, kind of partners, some of their primary constituents. And those interviews, just short kind of 30-minute things, and often they were shorter than that, were really valuable. First of all, because people did have stories to tell, particularly the people who were benefiting from their services had really impactful, kind of lovely, wonderful stories that they shared in those short interviews. And beyond the use in our planning for those, because we got a lot of really good information about the priorities of the organization, but I kept thinking, wow, if we could use these stories in other ways for this nonprofit, because it just really, people really spoke to the impact that their services had on kind of their lives and the changes that had been made. And I really felt like those stories were so valuable. And also it put kind of specific examples to some of the stuff we were seeing out of the other kind of quantitative data. And I just don't think it's information that we would have gotten in any kind of, survey. And yeah, I just see stories as being so critical to that, to planning. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you here today, because I found, Proofpact as a tool to be really, I think could be really valuable in helping to gather some of those stories in ways that maybe are a little more efficient than we scheduled tons and tons of interviews. And of course, trying to get people's schedules together is always kind of a nightmare. So I think I really see the impact in gathering stories, but I also see it in projects and in, promoting this event. Someone had, kind of commented that they don't think about stories when they think about projects, but I think when if you're building deliverables for users, knowing how they're going to use it, and, how it's going to impact them can be really, really valuable. And I think in more sort of agile project management methods, design thinking type of methods, getting those user stories and their feedback is so critical. And so that's kind of how I see stories impacting projects and planning. But are there kind of specific ways that you're seeing folks using stories in planning and or projects?
Yeah, you hit on some of the high points there. I think of it as bettering a user experience also. If you think about, outside of specifically strategic planning, because there's a lot of, reputation management is a flavor in there. And there's tools that we have that also, as you've seen, kind of outline and show in a drill down format the experiences had by staff or the experiences had by board members, and their stories can be analyzed at that point too. But the reason I say a bettering of a user experience is, if you think about so take donors for example. A donor makes a donation, and oftentimes they're redirected back to the nonprofit's website, or they are kind of that's usually where the interaction stops, I suppose. And well, I don't suppose, I know that's the case most often. It's in that moment that we should be asking them for their story. What motivated them to give? What motivated them to, take action right now? And if you wait, 10 minutes, they're likely off of their phone, gone from their computer, doing something else. If you wait 3 days, they're not thinking in those ways anymore. And if you wait 6 months or a year, whatever, you're not getting them. So you mentioned this earlier, and it's kind of nice because it's on their terms in these instances, but it's also in their terms at the right time. And for instance, like interviewing board members, trying to schedule that is kind of hectic. So if you give them this and say, we need we need your feedback in by the end of April, they can now do it on their terms, and you can send reminders and such. But it's way better than logistically trying to figure out, like, okay, well, when can we sit down with you to answer these specific questions? Then, oh, well, you can't do it for another 2 weeks. Okay, so we'll have to wait. and it's the same way for like the donors that are coming out of, that donation. It's done in a timely manner, still on their terms. They have ultimately they have the choice to share their story or not. And kind of this, the same way with volunteers too. Volunteers are also another cohort that I would consider, like, in a timely manner before they leave, the campus. Let's ask them for, their feedback, their story, like why did they volunteer? And so, yeah, I think timing is a huge one here that I think, and ultimately too, it's timing and then having everything in one place, because you don't want, things in Google Docs and people sending emails and, handwritten letters, things of that nature too. So yeah, you hit some very important reasons there as to why someone would want to use a platform like Proofpact. Yeah, it's timing is everything. User experience is everything too.
Yeah, and I do, when you were talking about volunteers, I can see getting their feedback as they're, right after they're volunteering, and what they enjoyed. And also I think there's a value sometimes in those individual stories. And so thinking about those kind of individual board interviews, obviously it would be easier to go into a board meeting and say, what do you guys think about this? But there's something about gathering it when it's just about that person and their story, that some of the people I'm sure that we interviewed, in that recent example of some strategic planning, what they shared in that kind of one-on-one was, I doubt many of them would have shared that much detail or information in some meeting with 10 other board members, right? There are people who just aren't going to kind of have those conversations. And so I think that individual piece of really getting some individual feedback and letting people tell the story in the way that they're comfortable telling it, because I do think something I see with planning, but also with projects, is sometimes we're using wording that doesn't mean anything to our community. And so getting, kind of hearing how they're describing, what we call one thing, I think can also be really helpful. And when you're kind of filtering people through some kind of clicking survey, they're not necessarily, kind of arguing with your with your wording there. So I don't know if you're seeing that value.
Absolutely right. They start thinking in ways that you would want them to think, right? Because you're guiding them, you're prompting them. And so all of a sudden they start giving you answers that they think that you would want to hear, I think. And one of the things that Proofpact does, by the way, is it starts with an open and relatively open-ended, share your story, right? It's from there where you can then choose to then follow up. And when you're engaging that storyteller afterwards, you can actually request, do you care if we follow up with you on, regarding your story? And it's in those follow-ups where you can then provide, let's say, or even directly after that story is shared, you could provide something like more of like a net promoter score style of a survey. But what you're doing is you're engaging them first in a way that they would want to be engaged. And you're right, they're telling their story how they want to tell their story, which is, I think, the beauty of it all.
So do you think it's that open-ended question that really is kind of the, for someone if people are listening who are trying to gather stories, is it that open-ended question that you think is creating that environment where people can really share?
It feels comfortable. It feels less pointed. It's not, I'm not trying to figure out what you want. I'm telling you what I want you to know, I think, at that point. So I think that's again, it's like a comfort thing. It's like, where would you want to start? Do you want to start by, going through this like list of questions, or do you want to start by, just tell us something, right? And it can be as simple as that. Obviously you want to provide a little bit of a boundary there, but yeah, ultimately it's comfortable.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, Dave. We're at about
Thank you.
15 minutes. This has been great. I'm sure we could talk longer. I'm always happy to talk longer. But anyway, so thanks. If you have questions about Proofpact or more about the work Dave's doing, do reach out. If you're interested, from my perspective, from Yazani Consulting's perspective, about getting meaningful stakeholder feedback, including gathering stories, that's really a focus of my streamlined strategic planning approach. And you can learn more at yazaniconsulting.com ISP. So thank you for participating in our Impactful Projects and Planning micro training series. You can visit yazaniconsulting.com IPP to view all of the sessions in this series and learn about upcoming training. So thanks, everybody.